So I'm going to be talking about design principles to help you improve your designs. But before I dive into it, I just want to start with a quick story. So a few months ago now, my partner decided to build his ultimate gaming machine. So he researched all the best parts that he needed. He went onto Amazon and ordered a motherboard, a really expensive GPU, and a case and keyboard which glowed. And a few days later, he was sat on our tiled bathroom floor piecing this thing together. And after about 6 hours or so, it resembled a computer. And so the time came to switch it on and see if it worked. So he plugged it in, he pressed the button, and nothing. Just completely black screen. And I was standing there watching, thinking, oh my God, he's going to freak out. All that time and money spent, and it didn't work. It's broken. But instead, he just kind of shrugged a bit and said, OK, let's fix this. And he got straight back to work mending his machine. So a little bit later on, I asked him, I said, so why didn't you freak out? After all that hard work, for nothing to have happened must have been so frustrating. And what he said really surprised me. He said, I didn't freak out because I haven't built a gaming machine in over 10 years. I wasn't ever expecting it to work the first time. But I knew that I could debug this. I knew that if the light didn't switch on, it was probably an issue with the power. I knew that if the light came on, but the screen didn't, it was something to do with the monitor. It was just a case of kind of assessing the situation as a whole, pinpointing the different issues, and then just fixing them one by one until it worked. So I run a website called Design Academy. And my goal with that is to teach developers, like my partner, how to design websites and apps so they don't look like they've been designed by a developer. And I've been working really hard to try and figure out how I can teach something like design to people who are technical, to people who appreciate and enjoy well-designed things, but they don't actually want to be designers. They want to be coders. And what I came to realize was that if my partner had been designing a website for 6 hours, if he'd watched loads of tutorials and read loads of articles on color theory, and then he stood back to admire his work, and it looked a bit like crap, then he would have just given up. He'd have thought, this is pointless. I just don't get design. I don't have that wacky creative flair that I need. It's not for me. And so what I came to realize is that design is a little bit like building a gaming machine. You can read all the right documentation, you can watch all the right videos, and it's still probably not going to work the first time. It's still probably not going to look good. But you shouldn't expect it to. Because as with the gaming computer, when it doesn't work the first time, you need to just stand back, identify all the different problem areas, and then fix them one by one. And then just keep going back and doing it over and over again. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I'm going to take a random website that I found, and I'm going to walk you through the steps that I took to debug it and improve the design. So these are the things that we're going to take a look at. So we're going to look at how to find good colors, how to choose good fonts. We're going to talk about hierarchy, layouts, and then we're just going to add a little bit of polish at the end. And this is the website that we're going to use. So it's for a developer called Michael Kimsel. And I chose it because I think it's a fairly typical website that I see by developers. And I should point out that it's not actually bad at all, but it just could be improved a little bit. And I should also point out that he's OK with me to use this as an example. So this is the design that we're going to end up with. And it's still pretty simple. It just looks a little bit more put together. So we deliberately haven't used any fancy techniques. It's all stuff that everyone in this room should be able to do. And I'm just going to show you step by step how we debug the design to get from the one on the left to the one on the right. So the first thing we're going to look at is color, as color is a pretty big part of a website and a brand and everything like that. Now, there are a few things that Michael here has done right. So firstly, he stuck to a pretty simple palette. He hasn't tried to mix loads and loads of colors into his design. We've basically got green, white, and gray. And that's going to make life a lot easier. And secondly, I actually think he's picked a pretty decent shade. And if I wasn't trying to teach you how to pick a decent color, I would probably have left it as it is. But let's assume that we don't have a color and we need to find one. So the first thing we need to do is decide on a color for your brand. So just pick something, either green, red, blue, pink, purple, and so on. And that's really as detailed as you need to be at this stage. And this color could come from your logo, or you could eliminate all your competitors' colors and try something completely different. So if all your competitors are using blue, maybe try orange or something like that. But at this stage, I wouldn't overthink it too much. So for the purposes of this, let's choose purple as our color. A lot of developers don't seem to use purple, so why not? So this is the default purple that comes in Keynote. I'm not a huge fan of this particular shade. So the next thing that we're going to do is to just choose a decent shade of purple. And I don't know about any of you, but I can almost never pick a nice color if I'm looking at something like the Color Picker, or if I go on to Color Lovers or any other color picking website. I just find it really, really difficult to tell which of these shades would look good applied to a website, and I always end up picking the wrong one, and it takes forever for me to go through and find something I like. So instead, what I do is I go to dribbble.com/colors. And there you have the option to search different shots based on a particular color. So we can pick one of the purple shades. We can click Update, and you'll just see loads of shots using the same color as this one. And the reason I like this over something like the Color Picker or Color Lovers is that you're not just looking at abstract colors. You're looking at colors that are used in real designs or real illustrations. So you've just got a little bit of context there. And after scrolling through, this color stood out to me. And I just used a Chrome extension called, I think, Color Picker Eyedropper to grab the hex code. So we can just apply this straight to the website. So we go from this to this. And now we've got a completely new brand color. And again, there was nothing wrong with what we had before, but I just wanted to show you a really easy way to choose a decent color if it's something you struggle with. So now you've got a decent color. You might need some others to go with it. And like I said earlier, when you're just starting out, I'd probably try to get away with as few colors as possible. So only add a new color when you absolutely need it. Not before. Don't try to create a palette and then apply it. Just get a new one exactly when you feel like you need a new one. So for our website, we've got a pretty nice palette currently. So we've got the purple we picked out earlier. We've got a lot of white. We've got a dark gray, which is used in the text. And there's actually a light gray there as well, which is used for a button. But I don't know, you can't really see well on the projectors, unfortunately. But there is something wrong with this palette. So those first three colors look pretty good together, but there's something off about that fourth one. And again, you really can't see it there, and actually it looks pretty good there. But I guess you'll have to trust me that it doesn't look good. So what you can see in that fourth color, if you were looking at my screen, is that it kind of looks brown compared to that dark gray, which looks a bit more blue. So what we should really do is just use a tint of that darker gray to form the lighter gray. So to do this, I just go to a website which I use all the time called Peloton.com. And what we'll do is we just put the hex color of that dark blue into the box, and it'll show you sets of tints and shades that you can use for your color. So all I'm going to do is take that light gray there and change our palette. So I don't know how this is going to work, but we've gone from this to this, which kind of looks really dark now compared to that. I don't know. Looks good on my screen. So you can see it applied here. It's not a really big change, but we've just got the start of a really nice, harmonious color palette. So the next thing we're going to do is just to take a look at the fonts. So the font that Michael has used here is Lato, or Lato, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, which is a really nice font from Google Web Fonts. But I kind of think on here it looks a little bit plain. So considering the website is pretty minimal in terms of graphics and colors, I think the typography really needs to be quite polished. So we're just going to look for some typefaces that can have a bit more visual interest. And we're going to stick with Google Web Fonts because it's free, the quality is pretty good. But it can be a little bit overwhelming when you go on here and you're just faced with this wall of fonts that you can choose from. But I've got a few tips that can kind of help you with your search. So the first thing is choosing 2 typefaces I find is often easier than choosing 1, which sounds a little bit odd. But that's because when you have just 1 typeface, it really needs to be kind of different and quirky enough to make for interesting headings, but it also needs to be clear and readable enough for long stretches of body text. And I find that that's quite hard for 1 typeface to do. It's possible, but it's just a little bit harder. But if you are going to have more than 1 font, just make them different enough to warrant the extra weight. So on this website, which I think is Harvest, the headings are actually a completely different typeface to the body text. And I'm not fully convinced that the extra weight of having a whole new typeface on the website is worth it in this case. So the easiest way to make sure they're different enough is just by using a serif typeface, which is the ones with the little flicks on the end, with a sans serif, so the ones without the flicks. So you could use a serif for the headings, a sans serif for the body text, or a sans serif for the headings and a serif for the body text. And finally, this kind of harps back to the first point, but look for the ones with the character for the headings, and then just keep it really simple for the body text. Something like open sans is always a good choice. So if we look at our list here, at first glance, I'd probably pick the following out for the headings, as they have a bit more character, and they don't really look like something that I'd want to read in long chunks. The rest are a bit simpler. They're not condensed. They don't have any quirky features on them. So in theory, we could probably pair any of the highlighted fonts with the non-highlighted fonts, and there's a good chance that they'll work. But if you want a slightly more foolproof way to pick out fonts than just scrolling through endless Google Web Fonts, there's a really nice website by Hayden Mills where he's put together different font pairings that you can use with Google Web Fonts. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to see if we can find one of these fonts and apply it to Michael's websites. So I'm going to go for a serif heading and then the sans serif body text, but other way around would work too. And here are some options that the website showed me. So because it's a personal website, I don't want it to look too corporate. I want it to have a little bit of personality in there. So I think these 2 look a little bit too academic, which I'm not really keen on for a developer's website. I think this one kind of reminds me of a fashion magazine, which doesn't really seem to fit the bill either. This is a maybe. It's a serif, but it's not too academic. It's got a little bit of character. This one's just a little bit too fancy and floofy, and I just don't think it would work for Michael's website. And I like this one as well. It's got character, but it doesn't have any weird flicks or swooshes. It just looks big, open, and friendly. So it kind of looks like these 2 are the winners. And here's Michael's website with the new typefaces applied. They're both using open sans as the body text, but for the headings, I personally think Roboto, which is on the right, is far better because it just looks more friendly, just looks a bit more personal, it's got a bit more character, so I'm going to run with that one. But when you go through this yourself, don't feel disheartened if you don't find something right the first time. Just keep trying different combinations until you find something that you can work with. And also, just because we've picked a nice typeface, it doesn't mean that the typography is finished. So we still have some work to do, but we're going to go over that in the next couple of sections. So the next bit is making sense of hierarchy. So for me, one of the biggest problems that I've got with Michael's website is that I don't quite know where to look, and I don't really know what to click on. So I really want to be kind of led around the website. So what does Michael want me to read first? What does he want me to do, and in which order? So there are a few key issues here that we're going to address to sort the hierarchy out a bit. So the first thing is that we've got quite an intense and cluttered navigation. So I wonder if all these links are needed in the main navigation. The sidebar also seems to take up a lot of prominence. I think it's the content on the right that should be the first thing we see. The heading of hello, to me, is quite unengaging, considering how prominent it is. These headings here could also use a little bit of differentiation. Currently, they look a little bit too similar. One of them's slightly smaller, but they kind of look a little bit the same to me. And finally, this is a small one, but that How I Help section has kind of equal spacing between the section above and the section below. Not immediately clear whether it's a section in its own right or whether it belongs to something else. So we're just going to look at these one by one, identify the problems, and fix them. So the first problem was the navigation. So here you can see I've made a few changes. I wanted to reduce it a bit, so I removed the home, because the logo links to the home page. I removed newsletter, as we have the call to action on this and other pages. I didn't really think it needs to be in the main navigation too. The resume, I thought, should probably be in the About page. And then I just added a really subtle button around Triangle Web Pros, because that's actually a completely different external website, and I just wanted to make it clear that it's something separate. So when it's in the current navigation in the same style, it doesn't really make too much sense. And then I just moved the whole thing to the right, just to keep it away from the main logo. So the next thing I did was I then just moved the sidebar from the left-hand side of the page to the right-hand side of the page. So contact information is obviously important, but I didn't want it to be the first thing that I saw. Because we read left to right, we should probably have the text on the left and then the supporting content on the right. So that was a pretty simple change. My next issue was the hello headline wasn't really engaging enough, so I made the headline more meaty. And if this was a real project, I'd have probably been looking at the copywriting to make sure the messaging is relevant and all that stuff. But because in this talk we're just focusing on visual design, I'm going to leave it as it is. And all I did was I took the first sentence from underneath and just put it in that the same style as the heading. And this just gives people something to read, and hopefully convinces them to keep reading. And I didn't really think hello on its own really did that. So we also had an issue where the headings looked too similar. So if you're going to have a new heading style, just make sure it's different enough to justify it. So we can keep the How I Help in the lighter weight and maybe just make those services smaller and bold. And this just makes it really obvious that they're different styles, and it gives it a little bit more hierarchy. And the last thing I wanted to change was to just make the How I Help section more obvious which block of text it belongs to. So in the original version, the spacing between How I Help and the previous paragraph and the next was exactly the same. But when you're designing something, it's really important to try to group relevant bits of content together. So in this example here, if you look at the middle circle on the right, it might not always be immediately obvious which block of text that circle belongs to. So does the circle have a label above? Does it have a label below? You might not be sure, especially if you're on mobile. So just make sure the spacing between different groups of content is larger than the spacing between the elements inside the groups, and you should be good to go. So I just moved the How I Help section close to the services, so it seemed more like an intro paragraph. And this is a really small change, but it's something you can apply everywhere to every website. So this is the before and after of the hierarchy, and it's not really much to look at right now, and I don't know about you, but I kind of think the original looks better. But that's OK, because it started to be differentiated, which is what we want. So we've got the basics of being led through a page, rather than just looking at something that pretty much looks the same. So now we're just going to see if we can make the whole thing just look a bit better. So to me, currently, everything looks a little bit cluttered now. So we just need to make it a bit easier on the eyes. And the process I usually use to come up with layouts is pretty simple. It's just a mixture of looking at the different content blocks that I've got to work with. I then look at other websites with similar kind of content blocks. And then I just kind of mix and match and sketch my own versions in thumbnail form. So the sketches are always really quick, always really ugly. Each one takes a maximum of 10 seconds. but it's just a really easy way to think about the different blocks of content that you've got and how they can be displayed. And it's much faster than trying to do anything digitally, for me anyway. So like I said, I usually just use websites that I like, and I just take blocks from each and build up my layout. So it's kind of like copying, really. So it's not great, but it's how I do it. So I'll mix and match components that are similar to my content, build up my custom layouts, based on other solutions that people have tried. But for Michael's website, we're going to keep the layout pretty simple, so we're not going to change it too drastically. Instead, I'm just going to make some really small changes that will build up to have something that looks good. So the first thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to have a look at the spacing. So the most jarring thing for me on this page is that big headline. It just looks really clustered together, and it just doesn't look right. And if you're like me, and you struggle to just look at typography and know how to size it, you can use something called the Modular Scale, which you might have heard of before. If you haven't, a modular scale is basically a sequence of numbers that relate to each other in some sort of meaningful way. So in typography, we can use the modular scale to size type in a predefined, visually pleasing way, so we don't have to guess ourselves. So if you go to typescale.com, you can see pretty much the default values I use in most of my web projects. Everything here is displayed in ems. I'm going to just be using the equivalent in pixels because I find it a bit easier to explain. So I set a base size for my text of 16 pixels, which would be 1em, and that's what I use for my body copy. And then I kind of just keep it at the default scale, really, because there's different options you can use, but I haven't really taken the time to figure out what an augmented fourth means or what the others kind of mean, but it looks good to me, so I just use that. And then you can just take these values and use them to restyle the text in the mockups. And this kind of takes into account line height as well, which is really useful. So if we use the modular scale, we've gone from this to this, which I think just looks much better. But the next thing I want to do is look at the column lengths. So the body text, for me, just looks really uncomfortable to read. And it's fairly well known that the ideal character length in one line of text should be somewhere between about 45 to 75 characters. But if we take the first line of body text on Michael's website, it actually comes in at 109 characters, so it's pretty long. So to fix this, all we have to do is just reduce the column length to make the text fit within that range. And this is what it looks like here. And now you can see that same first line now comes in at 71 characters, which is within the recommended range. However, now we kind of have the issue of this really awkward-looking block of white space. So let's see what we can do here. So if we look at the different chunks that make up the website, we can kind of rearrange them to find something that fits. So we've got the sidebar. We've got this content area, and these 4 services in those boxes there. And I'm just going to make them into squares so I can kind of see it a little bit better. So what if we could fit this column next to the other one to fill in that gap? We'd have to reduce the sidebar a bit, so maybe we can take out the logos and move them underneath the main text. I kind of think they look a little bit messy in the vertical line anyway. And yeah, that fits. So this is it with the layout change. But now we have that really big space on the right that looks a bit odd. So we just move the whole thing into the center, which I think looks much better. So the next thing I want to change with the layout is the navigation. So it's not this like big, bright purple bar at the top. So currently it just stands out way too much, and I think it looks a bit separate from the rest of the page. So all I'm going to do is remove the purple bar and then align the navigation with the rest of the content so it's a nice block. And I think it looks a little bit cleaner now, but everything still looks a little bit squashed together. So we're going to fix the spacing. And I find that spacing, or more accurately lack of spacing, is probably one of the more common issues that I see in websites, so that's what we're going to tackle next. And what I typically like to do is just pick one unit and then use that as a base to come up with values for the rest of the spacing. It's kind of like what we were doing earlier with the modular scale. So I usually pick a really simple number, like maybe 20 pixels or something, and I'll multiply and divide it by 20 to come up with different spacing measurements for my designs. So this is the current website, and we can build up the spacing units based on 20 pixels. So how about we make 20 pixels our paragraph size? That opens up the paragraphs a bit. What about we put 40 pixels, so 20 times 2, between the heading elements and the text below? Now, what about we do 60 pixels between the navigation and the content area, and also above the How I Help section? Now, if we take away the labels, we're left with something that looks like this. And I think the spacing just looks a lot more natural, especially when you compare it to the original version. So I think this website is looking pretty nice now. It's clean, it's got a bit of hierarchy, the layout's clearer, and we could potentially leave it as this, but I don't really want to do that. So I'm going to look at the last step of debugging your design, which is adding just a little bit of polish. So let's just see which areas could use something a little bit extra. And this is just where we go back again and analyze the design and just pick out things that you're not happy with. Your list might be completely different to my list, and that's perfectly fine. Usually I prefer to take a break at this point, preferably sleep on it, come back with fresh eyes, and then just have a look and see what you don't really like. So the first thing that sticks out to me is that big purple button taking up a lot of attention. And I don't really think we should be drawing quite as much attention to it, since it goes to a completely separate website, so that seems a bit counterintuitive. And currently, it's the most prominent thing on the page. Secondly, I think the whole page is pretty white, and I like white, but I just wonder if we can get a little bit more color in there somehow, while still keeping it quite clean and minimal. The next thing is the sidebar. It just looks a bit messy, and it kind of blends in a bit with the content on the left. So can we separate it a bit and just clean it up a little bit? I also have an issue with the capitalization being inconsistent. So sometimes it's title case, sometimes it's all lowercase. It's a small thing, but kind of bugs me a little bit. And I also think that this How I Help section could be a bit more interesting. It just looks a little bit bland and kind of undesigned. And finally, the call to action is a bit weak. I don't know if this is the call to action, but in this content, let's say it is. If it is, I don't think it should be in the sidebar, so maybe we can move it to the end of the page and make something more of it. So let's make some changes. So the first thing was the button. It was too prominent, so I changed it to a ghost button. And I don't usually like ghost buttons too much, but I think we really need to make it clear that it's a separate website, separate from the rest of the navigation, but without giving too much prominence to it. So in this case, I thought it was a good compromise. I also thought the page could do with a bit more color. So I made the main headline purple. I also toyed with making the logo purple, but just decided this had a little bit more impact. I didn't want to add a huge amount of color, so I just experimented with a few different places that it could work in. The next was the sidebar looking messy and not differentiated enough from the rest of the content. And this was quite a big change, so I'll talk about everything that we did here in a bit more detail. So the first thing that I did was I put a very light gray box around the sidebar. I made it very light gray because I didn't want it to stand out too much. I just wanted to make it look different from the rest of the content, so the text didn't really run into each other. I then gave the section a header of how to contact me. I put his email and phone number in a small paragraph of text underneath. This just differentiated it from the social links. Everything aside from the photo became left aligned, which just stops those raggedy edges and just makes it look a little bit neater. I added underlines to the links so they looked a bit more clickable, and went to Font Awesome to find some small icons to just put next to the social links. So the sidebar had a lot of small changes, but added up, I think it makes a really big difference. The whole thing just looks so much more neat and more professional. The next thing on my list was the capitalization that really annoyed me. So I changed everything in the content section to be sentence case, but I actually decided to leave the logo in lowercase, and I changed the navigation to all be lowercase too. And this just gives it the effect that I think Michael was going for in having lowercase b a stylistic choice, but it doesn't compromise on the overall readability of the content. And it's a small change, but to me, I think it makes a big difference. And the next thing was the how I help section. I wanted it to stand out on its own a little bit more. So the services are pretty important, and I think it looks a little bit bland like this. And this was another big change visually, but the steps were really simple. So like I said, I wanted this section to look more like a section in its own right. So I added another background, the same color as the one behind the contact box. And then I just put each service into a white rectangle with a 1-pixel border at a slightly darker gray than the background, which just kind of makes everything stand out a little bit more. And because this is a full-width section, and it's on a different background to the content above, I could actually get away with centering the headline and subheading without it looking too odd. So normally left line and center text near each other looks a little bit strange, so I don't usually do it. But in this case, it seemed to work. And this just made it look more like a headline. And again, I shortened the line length of that subheading to make it more readable. I then just put a really small, faint divider line between that and the boxes to just add a little bit extra polish. Not much point to that, but looks kind of nice. And the last change I wanted to make was for the call to action. So I really wanted the call to action to stand out a lot. And again, this looks like a big change, but it uses a lot of the same principles as the How I Help section. So I changed the background color, this time to our brand color, the purple, because when it's a call to action, it's pretty much allowed to be bright and it's allowed to stand out. It got made full width instead of just tacked to the bottom of the contact box, which meant that I could center the headline and the subheading again. I then just made the email field longer because email addresses are long, and I added a button to the right of it. Small thing, but the button's attached to the input aside from being separate, so it just makes it look more like one component than two. And finally, I changed the button color to a darker purple. So if you ever find that you need a new color and you're not quite sure what to do, the easiest thing to do, like we mentioned at the start, is to just use a tint or shade of the original color that it's on. So again, I found this color by going to Peloton, and I keyed in the base color that we used. Again, you'll see a lot of tints and shades you can use for each color. I wanted something a little bit darker, so I clicked on the presets, and I found a darker version of here for the button. And now the call to action just stands out a little bit more, and we've polished up the website. So, I mean, I think we're about done. So this is the final design that we've come up with. And we've come a really long way from what we started with. And in reality, we could just keep going over and over it again, tweaking it and amending it until it's even better. And that's all there really is to design, just analyzing what's wrong, amending it, and then learning from it. And over time, you'll have to make less amends, and you'll be able to do that thing that designers seem so natural at. You'll be able to just look at someone's design and then instantly identify the problem areas that need to fix them. And it just keeps getting easier the more you do it. So before we finish, I just want to let you know two things. Firstly, I'm currently writing a book on the subject of debugging design. So if you're interested and you want to know when it's released, you can go to debuggingdesign.co, put in your email address, and I'll just keep you posted on the development. Secondly, I'm also looking for a freelance Laravel developer. So I thought this was a good place to maybe find one. So if that's you, come find me afterwards and talk to me. I'd love to work with you. So I really hope this talk has been helpful in some way. The steps taken to debug a design are really important. But what's more important is just knowing that design isn't something that only a select few people can do. Just like when my partner was building his gaming machine, he knew it wasn't going to work the first time, but he just kept at it until the light switched on and he was playing Mass Effect 2 or something like that. So don't beat yourself up if you create something that just doesn't look right. Just use some of the tactics I shared here, and I promise that you will see improvements. Thank you.